We're going to jump into things. Hi, everybody. I am Steve Segar. I am the Rabbi of HaLev, which we meet just down the street here at the Ratner School. And it is great to be here with you. This is, I always say this is one of the best events in the Cleveland Jewish community all year on lots of different levels. So, all right, so we are going to just start at the top. Actually, I need my glasses. I have always been a fan of Jonathan Sacks, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, but that was cemented for me when I discovered this particular aspect of his teaching. So, ideally, it would be nice to have different people read, but I think just in terms of efficiency, at least for this part, I'm just going to read it and we can talk about it. But this is a quote from Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, Zichrono Livracha. He says, "I have argued elsewhere that biblical narrative is far more subtle than we usually take it to be. It is deliberately written to be understood at different levels, at different stages in our moral growth. There is a surface narrative, which some people call pshat, but there is also often a deeper story that we only come to notice and understand when we have reached a certain level of maturity." He says, I call this the concealed counter-narrative. So I think probably many of us are familiar with kind of the traditional fourfold levels of interpretation of Torah, pardes, pshat, remez, drash, sod, the surface meaning or the simple meaning, the allegorical meaning, the interpretive meaning through midrash, and then the Kabbalistic or mystical meaning. What he's talking about is none of those. And I just want to be clear, we should start there, that he's saying that the simple meaning actually has multiple layers to it. And that's a different perspective than the normal pardes perspective on the text. So that's where we're going to start. And I totally buy that. And we're going to start with a text. We're going to start in the middle, and then we're going to work our way backwards and forwards to try to understand what I think is a concealed counter-narrative in this Jacob text from chapter 28, as he is leaving his home after the crisis with his brother Esau, and he's stolen the birthright with his mother's help, and Esau wants to kill him, and his parents send him away. And and this is a text that's generally seen in a very positive light in Jewish tradition. Right? He leaves Beersheba, he goes to Haran, or he sets out for Haran, he comes to a place, he stays there for the night, he has this fabulous dream with the ladder, and the angels are coming down and going up, and then in the dream, God speaks to him. And this, I think, is a fascinating text that it never, I read this many, many times before I kind of felt like there was something more interesting going on here than I had realized at first. So, God says in the dream, "I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. The ground on which you are lying I will assign to you and to your offspring. Your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. You shall spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you and your descendants. Remember, I am with you. I will protect you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." We'll come back to this in a second. Then Jacob wakes up. He has this, amazing response. Surely, God is in this place and I did not know it. He says, how awesome is this place? Man no ra hamakom hazeh. And this is, the abode of God, the gateway to heaven. And then he took the stone that he had slept on and he pours oil on it to sanctify it as marking this place as a place of divine experience for him. And then he says, it says a vow here. He says, "If God remains with me, protecting me on this journey that I am making and giving me bread to eat and clothing to wear, and I return safe to my father's house, then," it doesn't say that, but that's the implication, "then In that case, the Lord shall be my God, and this stone which I have set up as a pillar shall be God's abode, and of all that you give me, I will set aside a tithe for you. Now, I think there are two really strange things about these two texts. The first one is really in the very first verse of the first text. It's really weird, and I don't know if anyone else notices it, but to me, this is part of the concealed counter-narrative. So does anyone want to just say what the weird thing is? If you, Marlene? Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, leaving out.
His brother, Isaac's.
Well, that's true. He doesn't say anything about, this is Jacob speaking, so he doesn't say anything about Esau. That's true. And that could be construed in a weird way. I think there's something even weirder than that. Even weirder than the fact that he doesn't mention Esau. Anybody else? Rabbi Rachel?
It says God of your father Abraham and God of Isaac.
Yeah. How weird is that? He says, right, he calls Abraham his father, and then he mentions Isaac with no connection to Jacob. It's like Isaac could be anybody. We know that Isaac is his father, but he could be anybody. So that's weird, right? That was the first thing that struck me as weird. The second thing that struck me as weird is if you look at what God says to Jacob in the dream, and then what Jacob vows when he wakes up, I think there's also something really kind of strange about that. And to me, it doesn't feel subtle at all to me. Yeah.
Making a deal. So many things have to happen, and then I'll worship.
All right. So first of all, he's not. He's kind of right. He's kind of like wheeling and dealing with God. So that's that's a little bit problematic on its own. But I think even more than that, he's asking God to do for him what God has already promised he was going to do for him. God already said he was going to do all these things. And here he wakes up and says, well, if you do this for me, so there's some kind of a disconnect between God's communication and his ability to receive the communication.
Or he doesn't trust God.
Or that's possible. That's possible, but he seems very, when he wakes up, he seems very moved by this experience, right? He says, the Lord is in this place. I didn't know it. This is, how awesome is this place? It's almost like he didn't remember the dream at all. Yeah, Alyssa.
But it does also mention, he's also promising things that he's not necessarily expected to do. The laws for tithing were not given yet, so he is already offering that he's going to do this conditionally.
Yeah. So what do you make of that?
So I think the fact that it's a value before it's a law is very interesting.
Right. Okay. That's great that it's a value, that the tithing is a value here before it becomes part of Jewish law. That's great. Yes, Gabriel.
I also think it's interesting when he says at the end, I will not leave you until I have done what I've promised you.
Yes.
It implies that once he's done, once they're settled there, he's going to leave.
Oh, that's a really great, I love that. I've never noticed that before. Right.
Like people always say, if there's a God, why didn't he stop this horrible thing? Or why does he let there be badness in the world?
That is really, really awesome. Right. So it seems like it leaves room for God to, at some point, to just vacate the premises, right? Once I've fulfilled these promises, okay, that's great. That's really great. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And the other thing that I think is less important for our conversation time, but it was still interesting to me, is that God's promise is quite expansive, right? It's, it's about the land. It's going to be assigned to you, your descendants. He makes these are all the classical promises, the Abrahamic promises. You shall spread out. All the families of the earth shall be blessed by you. And what does Jacob care about? I want food. I want clothes. I want protection, and I want to come back to my father's house. God says, I will bring you back to this land. Jacob's very focused on his own personal experience here. So that's another piece. Okay, so there's weirdness in this story, and I'm thinking, okay, where does the weirdness come from? So I think we have to go back in time a little bit. Yeah,
Well, I saw something totally different from you.
please.
And I saw this as part of a different narrative, with the narrative beginning with the vow, and Jacob says, if you bring me back to my father's home in peace, and then it is completed once they finally get back home, and he says, and Jacob returned to his father's house whole or in peace.
Yeah.
So I see that as its own narrative, beginning with the vow and ending, the whole story of Laban is part of the narrative.
No question, no question.
Ends that way.
But you feel like God's promise in the dream is not that big a deal here. It's like what's really important here is what Jacob says at the beginning and how it bookends on the other side of his experience with Laban. Yeah, okay, listen, there are many ways to read this. I am struck by, especially, I am the God of your father, Abraham. Of course, we know Abraham is not his father.
But Abraham's everybody's father.
Well, yes, but, at this point, right? This was before everybody came along. So this is only the second generation. So, all right. So let's bear with me. I know we do not have a huge amount of time here. Do we have until, what? Until 12:05. Okay. All right. So, all right, we're going to go back in time, back to Abraham's generation here. And we're not going to read through all of these texts, but I'll just paraphrase here. The second text is the text where after Abraham and Sarah decide, since they can't have a kid, they're going to take things into their own hands, and they're going to use Sarah's maidservant Hagar to give birth to, and that her son will then belong to Abraham and Sarah, presumably, but things go a little bit sideways, and Sarah isn't happy with how the dynamic has changed after Hagar conceives, and she's very upset. She's upset with Abraham. Doesn't always seem fair that she's so upset with Abraham, since she was really the one who initiated this, but that's another story. And she says to Abraham, I want this woman out of here. Kick her out. And Abraham says, she's your maidservant. You do with her what you will. And so this pregnant woman, they kick her out into the wilderness. That's pretty much certain death at this point, right? If you're in that part of the world, and then Hagar gets a revelation from God herself, which is kind of interesting, right? She's not officially part of Abraham's clan. She's from a different culture, and a messenger of God comes to her and makes her some promises that are somewhat parallel to the promises that Abraham has received and that Isaac will receive later. And he tells her to, but she has to go back and submit herself to, her mistress, even though that's a very, painful and frightening thing for her. And then Hagar does something really amazing. She names God. She is the first person in the Torah to give God a name, which is interesting, right? So she names God. She says, you are El Roi, you are the God who sees me. And then the Torah sees fit to explain what she meant by that, that she was able to still remain alive. I'm going to continue seeing after I was seen by God, because normally you think you're not going to survive that experience. And then she names that place Be'er Lachai Roi, the well of the living one who sees. Okay, that name becomes very important as we move through here. So that's part one of the background to this Jacob situation. Let me just say right now that first text we look at, I am going to propose that there is intergenerational trauma at work, which is why God speaks to Jacob the way he does about Isaac, and why Jacob is unable to take in the promises that God makes very clearly to him in the dream. Okay, so we're exploring where this intergenerational trauma came from. So the next text is the beginning of the binding of Isaac, the Akedah. And again, this is it's a very famous story. A lot of us find it very disturbing that God would command Abraham to offer up his son as a sacrifice, and very disturbing that Abraham seems to be very willing to do that, especially when we know that, he had argued with God about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah just a few chapters earlier. And, but for our purposes, that's a little bit less important. So, but anyway, right here in the text 3, Abraham saddles his donkey. He takes his 2 servants and his son Isaac, and the wood for the burnt offering, and he sets off for the place about which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place. And then Abraham says to his servants, "You stay here with the donkey, and the boy and I will go up there. We will worship, and we will return to you." It's very clear. Now, we know as the readers that might not happen, but he's not going to tell his servants what he thinks he's going to have to do up on the mountain. So then it's just Isaac and Abraham walking together without the servants. And in text 4, Isaac says to his father, again, these are very famous lines, Father, he says, "Yes, my son, Hineni bani. I see the firestone and the wood, but where is the sheep for the burnt offering?" And then Abraham famously says, "It is God will see to the sheep for this burnt offering, comma, my son." Yes, Gabriel.
What I noticed when I said this, it says, here are the firestone and the wood, but where is the sheep?
Yeah.
He's also kind of forgetting the knife.
Ooh,
Maybe on purpose.
yeah.
Because he kind of knows.
That is nice, Gabriel.
He's not saying.
Yeah, that's really nice. He doesn't mention the knife. Right. That is great. So, and maybe that's right. Maybe he just wants to keep a little distance from that reality in that moment. That's really good. That's really good. Thank you. Right. So we asked that question. Abraham answers it and says, God is going to see to the burnt offering. And the 2 of them walked on together. This is a phrase that's repeated at least 2 or 3 times in this narrative. The 2 of them walked together. Vayelchu shnehem yachdav. It happens several times. They arrive at the place. Abraham builds an altar. He lays out the wood. He binds his son Isaac. He lays him on the altar on top of the wood. And we know that eventually the angel interrupts. Abraham's ready to slay his son. Angel interrupts him and says, "Now, you don't need to do this, Abraham. Now I know that God knows that you are loyal to God because you have done this and not withheld your son, your favorite son. I will bestow my blessing upon you," and all of these, positive blessings come to Abraham as a result. "All the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by your descendants because you have obeyed my command." And here's the kicker. Abraham then returned to his servants, and they departed together to Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. What's the problem with that line? The 2 of them went together. The 2 of them went together. The 2 of them went together. Only Abraham comes down the mountain. It's interesting. The Torah doesn't, whatever you believe about where the Torah comes from, most Jews agree that words matter in the Torah. And the Torah puts words in when it wants to, and when it leaves words out, it's meaningful. So, and especially after emphasizing over and over that the 2 of them went together, and then Abraham comes down the mountain. Now, it doesn't say Isaac doesn't come down the mountain, but that absence is screaming because they've been together all the way along. And we know that this really difficult thing just happened. Isaac was almost sacrificed. So, Isaac apparently didn't come with Abraham down the mountain, at least not at the time that Abraham went back to his servants. We don't know what his servants said to him. If they asked him, like, "Hey, where's your son?" That would be a cool midrash to write. But, okay, that's 22:15-19. Very soon after that, we get text 6, which is the beginning of the next Torah portion, Chayei Sarah. And it says, Sarah's span of her life was 127 years. Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, now Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to bewail her. So that line also, to me, screams of, it's really interesting and problematic, because why did Abraham have to come from somewhere to mourn Sarah? This is happening sometime after the Akedah took place. We know where Sarah was. She was in Kiryat Arba. So where was Abraham? Well, Abraham went to Beersheba after the Akedah. Those two places are really far apart. Really, really far apart. So, Abraham was not with Sarah when she died. He had to come from a distant location to mourn her and then to find a burial plot for her. The other thing that's not said here, but that we know from later texts, we know that Isaac was really close to his mother. And Isaac does not show up at his mother's funeral. I would argue he doesn't show up at his mother's funeral because he does not want to see his father, because he has distanced himself from his father since his father put him through this horrific experience of almost sacrificing him. So Abraham comes from elsewhere, he buries his wife, and there does seem to be this distance between them. And the rabbis pick up on this, and they say Sarah dies, in fact, because she found out that Abraham almost killed her son. But they don't talk about the fact that Abraham is not living in the same place that she is when she dies. So where is Isaac? Because he's not at the funeral. Well, we find out just a chapter later, Rebekah and her maids arose. So after, Abraham sends his servant to find a wife for Isaac back in the homestead in Haran. And they meet Rebekah, the servant meets Rebekah, and she's the perfect wife for Isaac. And so they're bringing Rebekah back to Canaan. And the servant took Rebekah, went his way. Isaac had just come back from the vicinity of Be'er Lachai Ro'i, for he was settled in the region of the Negev. So what do we know about Be'er Lachai Ro'i from the first story? Where did that name come from? Hagar gave that name to that location. So Isaac went to live in the place that is Hagar's place. Isaac chose, he didn't go down the mountain with Abraham, and he goes to live in the place of the woman who was in exile that his mother and his father exiled from the camp. Yeah, Gabriel.
Maybe it also represents that he felt exiled.
Absolutely. I think that's...
His father tried to kill him.
Absolutely. I think you're right on target. I think he is there because he identifies with Hagar, and he feels like he and Hagar had similar experiences. And again, it's really interesting that the Torah points out that Isaac was living in the place that Hagar, where Hagar had her revelation from God and where she named that vicinity. Okay. Next text. How are we doing? Okay, we're doing okay.
I think that,
Yeah.
that Isaac also reconciled with Ishmael. And they talk about it later on.
They do.
With Abraham's death.
Right.
But I think that I just realized it just now as we're reading it, this is probably where it occurred, is the reconciliation.
It could be. It could be. Right. There's nothing explicit here about Ishmael, but we could say he identified with Hagar and with Ishmael.
It's implicit.
Yes, I think you're right. I think you're right. And, we know chapter 22 of Genesis is where Isaac almost dies at Abraham's hand. Chapter 21, we read both of these on Rosh Hashanah, right? Chapter 21 is where Ishmael almost dies because Abraham sends Ishmael and Hagar back out into the wilderness at Sarah's insistence because she did not feel comfortable with the way that Ishmael and Isaac were interacting after Isaac was born. And so that, again, was a death sentence for Ishmael. And I think, absolutely, I think Isaac identifies with both of them at this point. So, All right. We're going to jump now down to the birth of Isaac's children, Isaac and Rebekah's children. Again, these texts are all well known to many of us. But they're twins. The first one emerged red like a hairy mantle. That's Esau. And then his brother Jacob emerged holding onto the heel of Esau, Yaakov. That's where he gets his name from. Isaac was 60. Okay, when the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the outdoors, but Jacob became a mild man, raising livestock. And again, here I think is the clue line. Isaac loved Esau because he had a taste for game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Now, I'm going to suggest that Isaac loved Esau not just because he had a taste for game, but because Esau represented a kind of physical strength that Isaac himself did not feel he had, and he projected onto the older of the two boys, older by a minute or whatever. I think that's a part of his attraction to his older son, the physical vitality that Esau possessed, because that was, he could have used that when he had his experience with Abraham. Yeah, Gabriel.
It's also interesting that they say that Esau was born hairy.
Yes.
Babies aren't usually born hairy.
Babies aren't usually born hairy, except on their head sometimes, right? So yeah, that is. And they put in that detail, and that would be an interesting thing to think about, like why, what could that mean? So, right, but Isaac did not love Jacob in the way that Rebekah did, or in the way that he loved Esau. So Jacob probably felt that and knew that from a very early age, that his father did not feel about him the way his mother did. And the part of the reason I would say his father didn't feel that way was because Esau was more of the kind of man that he wanted to be. And Jacob reminded him of himself. He was a quiet, a mild man raising livestock. Jacob reminded Isaac of himself in a way that did not feel good to him. That's my reading of this. So, okay. So we know what happens. There's the whole deception of Isaac by Jacob and Rebekah. Then Jacob has to leave. And again, this is right before the first, we're coming up to the first text finally. We're coming back to that. Jacob has to leave, and he goes to the relatives in Haran, to Lavan, and he spends 20 years there. We don't have to go into the details of that, but when he's ready to leave, Lavan makes it pretty difficult for him, right? Lavan says, you can't, Lavan wants Jacob to stay because it's like good for Lavan. It's economically, it's making him economically prosperous, and Jacob does not want to stay there, and Jacob's wives do not want to stay there. They're trying to leave, and I think this next quote, and I should have double checked this. This is either when Jacob and his family left, they did it under the cover of night. They did it secretly. They didn't tell them. So I think this is where Lavan catches them on their way back to Canaan. And he accuses Jacob. He says, "What are you doing? You're stealing my daughters and you're stealing my livestock." And then Jacob answers him. He says, "Had not the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac been with me, you would have sent me away empty-handed. But it was my plight and the toil of my hands that God took notice of and gave judgment one last time." So I made a mistake. This happens obviously after the text that we first saw. So I think what's really, again, fascinating, God says to Jacob, "I am the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac." And after 20 years, Jacob says to his uncle, "The God of Abraham, the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac." So there's some progress here for Jacob, because he's a little bit more connected to Isaac because he can say, it's not just the God, or he's not quite ready to say what God said, the God of Isaac. He calls God the fear of Isaac, which is a really powerful way of referring to God. And to me, this is a statement that he is aware of Isaac's relationship to God, and it was not a positive relationship. It was a relationship built on fright and the threat of losing his life. And the fear of Isaac is how he refers. Still, by the way, does not say anything about Isaac being connected to him, to Jacob. He still says, the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and then Isaac's in this separate category, the fear of Isaac. Okay, that's the next text, which is just a few verses further down. At the very end, after they kind of reconcile, they set up a boundary and they say, okay, I'm going to stay on this side, Jacob says, and Laban says, I'm going to stay on the other side. And they swear an oath to each other. And Laban says, may the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor judge between us. And Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. So here's another step in that direction for Jacob. He's still calling God the fear of Isaac, but now it's the fear of his father Isaac. So he has now recognized a relationship to this person that he could not recognize before. So something that happened, that 20-year period changed him. He was able to say, my father. He could not say my father when he talked about Isaac up until this point. Yes?
Is it a true fear? Because over the years, I've heard different rabbis use the word reverence rather than fear.
I think that is such a cop-out because in Hebrew, the word is pachad. People often talk about the word yirah, which is another word for fear in Hebrew, but can also mean awe or reverence. But here, it's pachad yitzchak. It's not awe or reverence. It is raw fear. Quaking in the boots. That's how I understand it, at least. So, but he at least is able to say that Isaac is his father for the first time. Okay. Then Jacob and his family continued to go to Canaan, and Jacob comes and is encountered by the messengers of God, by angels, by malachim. And when he saw them, Jacob said, this is God's camp, so he named the place Machanaim. I think this is just the bookend. We were talking about bookends before of the 20 years where Jacob stayed with Laban. So he started off in a place where he saw angels going up and down the ladder, and then as he's about to come back into the land, he has an encounter with angels again. So that bookends his entire experience, and we see that he's making progress spiritually because he can now recognize his connection to his father that he was estranged from, and he is getting ready to go back to the land. He knows he's going to encounter his brother Esau for the first time, and the last time he saw Esau, Esau swore he was going to kill him. So he's afraid, and he offers a prayer to God right before he goes back into the land. And listen to this prayer. O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac. I feel like I get so emotional reading those words. He has completely reclaimed his relationship with his father at this moment. God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your native land and I will deal bountifully with you. I am unworthy of all the kindness that you have steadfastly shown to your servant. The tone is completely different from the prayer that he uttered the night that he woke up when he had the dream of the ladder. He is humble. He recognizes that he does not deserve anything in particular. He doesn't take anything for granted. With my staff alone, I crossed the Jordan. Now I have become two camps. Deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau. Else I fear he may come and strike me down, mothers and children alike. Yet you have said, I will deal bountifully with you and make your offspring as the sands of the sea, which are too numerous to count. I don't think it's a coincidence that right after he acknowledges that he is connected to his father through the spiritual tradition for the first time, that he can utter a prayer in which he acknowledges that God has been good to him and he didn't deserve it. And he's spiritually much more developed than he was, which is not surprising because he's 20 years older, but he's going through some really difficult experiences himself, but it's changed the way he thinks about his father and the rest of his family. So he's afraid. And the very next thing that happens, we're almost done. We're almost out of time here. Right after that is he sends all of his family over to the far side of the river. He goes back alone, and he wrestles with the angel. I don't think it's a coincidence that he doesn't wrestle with the angel until he is reconciled internally with his father, and he's reconciled with God in some way too, and he's ready to wrestle with the angel, which many people say represents Esau in some way, or represents, a part of himself. He has that wrestling match, and at the end, the angel says to him, "What is your name?" He replied, "Jacob." When was the last time that someone asked Jacob who he was? It was when he was deceiving his father, and he was pretending to be his brother. So the last time that question was asked, it's not an exact quote, but the last time that question was asked to him, he said, "I am Esau, your eldest son." Now he says, he owns his identity. He says, "I am Jacob." He's right. That's exactly right. And at that point, the angel changes his name. Or he says, you shall no longer be known as Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with beings divine and human and have prevailed. Okay? So all of these are all steps in his healing process, I think. And, and I think they're powerful, and I think they're real in the text. We're going to go through the last text really quickly. So basically, but it's not a complete healing. And we get that information as we go on, because what's the first thing? So he meets up with Esau, he's terrified, but then they end up seeing each other, and Jacob bows down 7 times, and he offers Esau all of this tribute, and Esau is completely open-hearted with him, and they cry. They have a reconciliation. They cry on each other's shoulder, and Esau is so happy to be with his brother Jacob, and he says, let's travel together. Let's go and make our lives together now. And Jacob says to him, "Well, I can't go as fast as you. I have all these little kids, but you go on ahead and I'll meet you there." But then Jacob does not follow his brother. He deflects this whole invitation from Esau, and he goes to a completely different place where his brother is nowhere to be seen. So to me, that is he had this kind of reconciliation with his father and with God, but it didn't quite penetrate all the way to his relationship to Esau, because he does not want to be where Esau is. Here's the second sign that he did not have a full healing, because when he gets back to the land, the first thing we learn about him is that he loved Joseph best of all of his sons, and he made him this special coat. And when the brothers saw that their father loved Joseph more than any of them, they hated him, so they could not speak a friendly word to him. Jacob has not learned that lesson about his family experience. He knew what it was like not to be loved as much by his father, and yet here he is repeating that very same pattern with his son Joseph. That's a signal that he is not completely gone through a complete healing process. Last but not least, in Genesis 47, after Joseph reveals himself to his brothers and they go back to Canaan, they get Jacob, and the whole family comes down to Egypt, and everybody meets Pharaoh, because Joseph is the vice Pharaoh, and he wants his family to meet his, the person he works with. And he introduces Jacob to Pharaoh, his father. Jacob is father to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh asks him, "How old are you?" basically. And Jacob's answer is, this is a very stunning answer. We're done. Okay. "Few and hard have been the years of my life, few and hard, nor do they come to the lifespans of my ancestors during their sojourn." So I think bitter actually might even be a better translation of the Hebrew. So basically, Jacob says, my life has been really difficult. And there is not a sign here of the appreciation, the gratitude that he expressed to God before he came into the land. All right, so that's where we're going to stop. And the last piece has to do with Ephraim and Manasseh, and that's a little bit of healing that comes back in at the end. But that is the That's the story, and I think this is an example of what Rabbi Sachs talks about. I think there is a concealed counter-narrative in the text that tells a very different story about the patriarchs and the relationship between them and what they had to go through in order to reach a certain level of spiritual development. So thank you all for being here. I'm sorry we didn't have enough time to talk about it.